Marcus Reed stared at the orders on his tablet screen and felt his jaw tighten. 3 decades of military service, and this was what they gave him, babysitting duty on some backwater planet nobody cared about. The words on the screen were clear. Enough. Teach basic survival skills to alien refugees on Kepler 442b. Duration: 6 months. Priority: low. He crushed his cigarette under his boot and walked across the landing pad where his transport waited. The pilot barely looked up as Marcus threw his gear bag into the cargo hold. Inside the bag were the tools that had kept him alive through countless missions: his knife, fire starter, water purification tablets, and 1,000 other small items that meant the difference between living and dying in hostile territory. The journey to Kepler 442b took 2 weeks through hyperspace. Marcus spent most of it reviewing the files on his new charges. The Vorthak were refugees from a dying star system. Their homeworld had been slowly freezing as their sun failed, forcing them to flee in massive colony ships. The Terran Federation had granted them sanctuary on this remote planet. Far from major shipping lanes and strategic interests, the files painted a picture of a peaceful species, tall and graceful with pale blue skin that seemed to shimmer in the right light. Their society had been built around cooperation and harmony. They had never known war or violence on a large scale. Their technology was advanced but focused on comfort and beauty rather than survival and warfare. Marcus shook his head as he read through their colony reports. Equipment failures were mounting daily. Food stores were running low despite regular supply drops. Several Vorthak had already died from exposure during the harsh winter months. The colony administrator had requested basic survival training for the population. The transport dropped out of hyperspace near Kepler 442b, and Marcus got his first look at his new home. The planet was slightly smaller than Earth, with 2 small moons that created complex tidal patterns. Most of the surface was covered in thick forests broken up by rolling plains and mountain ranges. It looked like a beautiful place to live if you knew how to work with the land instead of against it. The shuttle descent took 3 hours through thick cloud cover. Marcus watched through the small window as they passed over the Vorthak settlement. It looked like someone had dropped a small city in the middle of nowhere. Gleaming white buildings stood in neat rows surrounded by perfectly manicured gardens. Everything was clean and orderly and completely wrong for a frontier colony. The landing pad was located at the edge of the settlement. As Marcus stepped off the shuttle with his gear bag slung over his shoulder, he could see dozens of Vorthak watching him from a safe distance. They were even taller than the files had suggested, most of them standing well over 7 feet. Their large eyes tracked his movement with obvious curiosity, and what might have been fear. An elderly Vorthak approached him with slow, careful steps. His skin was a deeper blue than the others and marked with intricate patterns that might have been tattoos or natural markings. He wore simple robes that looked elegant but completely impractical for manual labor. "I am Fane, leader of this settlement," the alien said in accented but clear English. "You must be the human instructor we were told to expect." Marcus nodded and shifted his bag to his other shoulder. "Marcus Reed, I'm here to teach survival skills." Thane's large eyes studied Marcus for a long moment. The human was shorter than any adult Vorthak but built like a block of stone. Scars marked his hands and face. His clothes were practical and worn. Everything about him spoke of violence and hardship. "We appreciate the Federation's concern for our welfare," Thane said carefully. "Though I must admit we are uncertain what you can teach us that our technology cannot provide." Marcus looked past Thane at the settlement beyond. Even from here he could see the problems. The buildings were beautiful but not designed for this climate. Water was pooling in the wrong places after recent rains. The gardens were struggling because the soil had been cleared instead of enriched. These people had the knowledge to travel between stars, but they had never learned to read the land they stood on. "Your technology is failing," Marcus said bluntly. "I can see it from here. When it's all broken down and the supply ships stop coming, what then?" Thane's expression tightened slightly. "Our equipment is quite reliable. The recent failures are Simply growing pains as we adapt to this new environment. Right, Marcus said. He had heard the same words from 100 different commanders in 100 different situations. Pride came before the fall every single time. Well, I'm here for 6 months either way. Might as well make the best of it. Thane led him through the settlement toward the quarters that had been prepared for him. Other Vortheks stopped what they were doing to watch the human pass. Some seemed curious, others fearful, a few looked openly hostile. Marcus was used to that reaction. Humans had a reputation throughout the galaxy, and not all of it was positive. The quarters were comfortable but sterile. Clean white walls, soft furniture, climate control that hummed quietly in the background. It reminded Marcus of a hospital room. He dropped his gear bag on the floor and looked around with distaste. "I'll need space to work," he told Thane. "Somewhere outside the settlement where I can set up training areas. And I'll need volunteers, people who want to learn." "I will make arrangements," Thane said. "Though I should warn you that many of our people are reluctant to embrace what they see as primitive methods." Marcus smiled for the first time since arriving. It was not a particularly pleasant expression. "They'll change their minds when winter comes and the heaters stop working. They always do." After Thane left, Marcus unpacked his gear and began to plan. He had 6 months to turn a group of helpless refugees into people who could survive on their own. It would not be easy, and it would not be pretty. But Marcus had never been asked to do easy jobs. That was why they sent him to places like this, outside his window. He could see young Vorthak playing in the artificial gardens while their parents worked with failing machines. They had no idea what was coming, but Marcus did. Winter was only a few months away, and when it arrived, the real test would begin. The first training session was a disaster. Marcus had set up a simple demonstration area outside the settlement where he planned to teach basic fire starting. 20 Vorthak volunteers had gathered to watch, most of them young adults who seemed more curious than committed. Marcus knelt beside a small pile of dry grass and wood shavings he had prepared. He pulled out his fire starter and began to work, explaining each step as he went. The Vorthak watched with polite attention as sparks caught the tinder and grew into a small flame. "Fire is life," Marcus said as he fed small twigs to the growing flame. "It keeps you warm, cooks your food, purifies your water, and scares away predators. Everything else comes after fire." A young female Vorthak named Kira raised her hand. She was smaller than most of her people, with bright, intelligent eyes, and an expression that suggested she was not easily impressed. "Why would we need such primitive methods when we have thermal generators and food processors?" Marcus looked up from his fire. "What happens when they break?" "They do not break," Kira said with confidence. "Our technology is designed to last." For centuries, Marcus stood and brushed dirt from his knees. "Everything breaks eventually. Metal fatigues, circuits burn out, power sources fail. The question is what you do when that happens." He walked over to the nearest building and pointed at a small device mounted on the wall. "That's your atmospheric processor, right? Keeps the air inside clean and comfortable?" Several Vorthak nodded. They had similar devices throughout the settlement, each one humming quietly as it worked. "How long since it was serviced?" Marcus asked. The Vorthak exchanged uncertain glances. Thane, who had been watching the demonstration with obvious skepticism, stepped forward. "Our technical staff maintains all essential systems on a regular schedule. When was the last time?" Marcus pressed. More uncertain glances. Finally, an older Vorthak with patterns marking his skin spoke up. "The maintenance schedule was disrupted during our journey here. We have been waiting for replacement parts from the Federation." Marcus nodded. "And how long have you been waiting?" 4 months, the older Vorthak admitted. 4 months, Marcus repeated. He walked back to his fire, which was now burning steadily. "This fire will keep burning as long as I feed it wood. It does not need replacement parts or technical support. It just needs fuel and attention." Kira crossed her arms. "You want us to give up centuries of advancement to live like primitives." "I want you to live," Marcus said simply. "Everything else is negotiable." He spent the rest of the session teaching basic fire starting techniques. Most of the Vorthak struggled with the concept, their long fingers unused to the rough work of striking flint against steel. Several gave up after a few failed attempts. Only Kira and a handful of others persisted until they managed to create their own small flames. The next few weeks followed a similar pattern. Marcus introduced new skills, water purification, basic tool making, food identification, and most of the Vorthak approached them with polite disinterest. They attended the sessions because Thane had asked them to, but their hearts were not in it. The problems in the settlement continued to mount. The food processors were working at half capacity, forcing the colonists to ration their meals. Several buildings developed leaks when the sealant compounds began to fail in the local climate. The atmospheric processors were struggling to cope. With increased humidity during the rainy season. Marcus watched it all with grim satisfaction. He had seen the same thing happen on a dozen worlds. Advanced civilizations always made the same mistake. They built systems that worked perfectly under ideal conditions but fell apart when reality intruded. The turning point came during a shelter building lesson Marcus had been trying to teach a group of Vorthak how to construct simple lean-to shelters using only materials they could find in the forest. Most of them were struggling with the concept of lashing branches together when the rain started. It was not a gentle shower but a driving downpour that soaked everything in minutes. The Vorthak abandoned their half-built shelters and ran for the settlement, leaving Marcus alone with his demonstration shelter. He settled under the simple roof he had constructed and waited for the storm to pass. Kira was the first to return, her elegant robes dripping with rainwater. She found Marcus sitting comfortably under his shelter, completely dry, despite the continuing downpour. "How?" she asked, pointing at the simple structure. Marcus shifted to make room for her under the shelter. The angle of the roof sheds water instead of collecting it. The materials are woven together tight enough to keep out rain, but loose enough to let air circulate. It took me 20 minutes to build with no tools except my knife. Kira studied the construction carefully, running her long fingers along the lashed joints. The engineering is quite elegant in its simplicity. Engineering, Marcus repeated with a slight smile. I suppose that is one way to look at it. Other Vorthak began to trickle back as the rain continued. Soon there were 8 of them crowded under the small shelter, staying dry while they advanced. Buildings of their settlement leaked and groaned under the storm. "Teach me," Kira said quietly. Marcus nodded. "Tomorrow we start over. This time pay attention to why we do things, not just how." The storm lasted 3 days. By the time it ended, half the electronics in the settlement had been damaged by water infiltration. The Vorthak were forced to live without climate control, without food processors, without most of the technology they had taken for granted. Marcus found Thane standing in the central plaza, looking at the pools of water that had collected where there should have been proper drainage. The elderly Vorthak leader looked older and more tired than before. "Perhaps," Thane said without looking at Marcus, "we should pay more attention to your lessons." "Perhaps you should," Marcus agreed. The next training session had 40 volunteers instead of 20. They listened with genuine attention as Marcus taught them to read the land, to understand how water moved and where it would collect, to work with natural forces instead of against them. Kira proved to be his best student, her quick mind grasping concepts that others struggled with. She began to see patterns in the landscape, to understand the logic behind Marcus's seemingly primitive methods. "You are not teaching us to be primitive," she said after successfully starting her 5th fire of the day. "You are teaching us to be adaptive." Marcus nodded. "Now you are beginning to understand." 2 months into his assignment, Marcus noticed the changes beginning to show in the Vorthak. Their soft hands were developing calluses from working with rope and stone. Their movements had become more purposeful, less graceful but more practical. They no longer flinched when he demonstrated how to gut a fish or skin a small animal. Kira had become his unofficial assistant, helping to translate his instructions into concepts the other Vorthak could understand. She had developed an intuitive understanding of survival principles that impressed even Marcus. Where other Vorthak saw random wilderness, she could identify water sources, potential shelter sites, and edible plants. The key is to think like the environment, she explained to a group of newer students as Marcus watched from nearby. Water always flows downhill. Animals follow the same paths to drinking spots. Plants grow where conditions are right for them. Everything is connected. Marcus had moved beyond basic survival skills to more advanced concepts. He taught them to track animals by reading signs in the dirt, to predict weather by watching cloud formations and wind patterns, to understand the rhythm of the forest around their settlement. The Vorthak proved to be quick learners once they abandoned their preconceptions about primitive methods. Their natural intelligence, freed from dependence on failing technology, adapted rapidly to these new challenges. What had seemed like barbarian skills began to make sense as sophisticated ways of reading and working with the natural world. The real test came when a hunting party returned with disturbing news. Rippers had been spotted less than 5 kilometers from the settlement. The Wolf-like predators were native to Kepler 442b and known for their intelligence and pack-hunting behavior. Previous encounters with human settlements had proven them to be dangerous opponents. Panic spread through the Vorthak colony faster than Marcus had expected. These were people who had never known violence, who had lived their entire lives in safety. The idea of predators actively hunting them was beyond their experience. Marcus called an emergency meeting in the central plaza. Nearly the entire adult population gathered to hear what he had to say. Their large eyes were wide with fear as they waited for his assessment. Rippers hunt in packs of 6 to 12 individuals, Marcus began without preamble. They are intelligent, patient, and they will test your defenses before they attack. But they are also predictable if you understand their behavior. Thane stepped forward, his aged face grave with concern. What do you recommend we do? Should we request military support from the Federation? Marcus shook his head. Help would take weeks to arrive, and the Rippers will not wait that long. We defend ourselves or we become prey. The crowd stirred nervously at his blunt words. Several Vorthak began speaking at once, their voices rising in pitch as fear took hold. Marcus waited for the noise to die down before continuing. We build barriers around the settlement perimeter. Nothing fancy, just trenches backed by sharpened stakes. We organize watch rotations so someone is always alert. We prepare weapons and teach everyone how to use them. Weapons? An elderly female Vorthak asked in horror. We do not use weapons against living creatures. Then you will die, Marcus said simply. Rippers do not share your moral philosophy. Kira moved to stand beside Marcus, her young face set with determination. He is right. Our principles mean nothing if we are not alive to practice them. The debate that followed was heated but brief. The Vorthak were a practical people despite their peaceful nature. When faced with extinction, they chose survival. The next week was a frenzy of activity. Marcus supervised the construction of defensive barriers while teaching crash courses in spear fighting and fire tactics. The Vorthak worked with desperate energy, their soft hands bleeding as they dug trenches and sharpened stakes. Kira proved to have a talent for weapons training that surprised everyone, including herself. Her natural grace translated well to spear work, and she quickly became proficient enough to help train others. Other young Vorthak followed her example. Abandoning their reluctance to embrace these harsh new realities, the attack came on a quiet evening, just as the settlement was finishing its preparations. Marcus was making his final inspection of the defensive positions when the watch called out a warning. Shapes were moving in the tree line, dark forms that seemed to flow rather than run. The Rippers emerged from the forest in a coordinated assault that spoke of intelligence and planning. They were larger than earth wolves, with powerful jaws filled with razor-sharp teeth. Their eyes gleamed with predatory cunning as they tested the barriers. Looking for weak points, Marcus had positioned himself at the main gate where the attack would likely focus. Kira stood beside him with a fire-hardened spear gripped in her long fingers. Around the perimeter, Other Vorthak waited at their assigned positions, their faces pale but determined. The first Ripper to charge the gate learned why humans had conquered half the galaxy. Marcus met its leap with a thrust of his spear that took the creature through the chest, using its own momentum against it. The Ripper dropped dead at his feet as its packmates circled for another approach. "Fire!" Marcus shouted. Torches flew from the defensive positions, creating pools of light that confused and frightened the predators. Rippers were ambush hunters who relied on darkness and surprise. Bright light disrupted their natural advantages and forced them to attack on human terms. The battle lasted less than an hour, but it felt like days to the Vorthak defenders. They fought with desperate courage, their training taking over when fear threatened to overwhelm them. Spears thrust and torches blazed as the peaceful colonists discovered they could be warriors when survival demanded it. When the last Ripper retreated into the darkness, 8 of the predators lay dead around the settlement perimeter. The Vorthak had suffered only minor injuries, cuts, and bruises from the frantic fighting. They stood in their defensive positions, breathing hard and staring at the carnage they had created. Thane approached Marcus with tears streaming down his blue face. The elderly leader's robes were torn and dirty, his hands bloody from gripping an unfamiliar spear. But his large eyes shone with something that had not been there before. "You have given us something we never knew we needed," Thane said, his voice thick with emotion. "The strength to stand against the darkness." Marcus pulled his spear from the Ripper's corpse and wiped the blade clean. Around him, the Vorthak were beginning to realize what they had accomplished. They had faced death and emerged victorious. They had discovered that peaceful people could still be dangerous when threatened. "You always had the strength," Marcus told Thane. "You just needed to learn how to use it." The message from Federation Command arrived on a routine supply transport 6 months after Marcus had first set foot on Kepler 442b. His assignment was complete, and he was ordered to return to Earth for reassignment. The Vorthak colony had been deemed self-sufficient and no longer required human oversight. Marcus read the orders while sitting in his quarters, surrounded by the gear he had never fully unpacked. Through his window he could see Vorthak working in gardens they had learned to cultivate properly, repairing buildings with techniques that used local materials instead of failing synthetic compounds. The settlement looked different now, more organic and integrated with its environment. He was packing his few belongings when Kira knocked on his door. She had changed dramatically over the past months, her soft features hardened by outdoor work, and her movements precise with practiced confidence. She wore practical clothing now instead of elegant robes, and her hands bore the calluses of someone who worked with tools every day. "The transport leaves tomorrow?" she asked, though they both knew the answer. Marcus nodded and continued folding his spare clothes. "First thing in the morning. Should reach Earth in about 3 weeks." Kira was quiet for a long moment, watching him pack. Finally she spoke again. "What will happen to us after you leave?" "You will do what you have been doing," Marcus said without looking up. "You will survive? And if we face another crisis? Another threat we cannot handle?" Marcus stopped packing and turned to face her. "Then you will handle it anyway. That is what survival means." Kira nodded slowly, but her expression remained troubled. "I fear we have become too dependent on your guidance." "You have become capable," Marcus corrected. "There is a difference." That night, the Vorthak held a farewell ceremony in the central plaza. The entire settlement gathered to thank Marcus for his service and to wish him well on his journey home. Thane gave a formal speech praising the humans' dedication and the transformation he had brought to their people. Marcus accepted their gratitude with typical awkwardness, uncomfortable with ceremonies and formal recognition. He was a practical man who measured success by results, not words. The fact that the Vorthak were still alive and thriving was thanks enough. The ceremony was interrupted by a messenger, who arrived running from the long-range communications station. His face was pale with panic as he whispered urgently to Thane. The elderly leader's expression grew grave as he listened to the report. "What is it?" Marcus asked, recognizing the signs of crisis. Thane turned to address the gathered crowd, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. The Geological Survey Station reports massive volcanic activity on the far side of the planet. The eruption appears to be much larger than any previously recorded. The implications hit Marcus immediately. A major volcanic eruption would affect global weather patterns, potentially triggering climate changes that could threaten all life on Kepler 442b. He had seen similar disasters on other worlds, and knew how quickly things could deteriorate. "How long until the effects reach us?" Marcus asked. "The initial atmospheric disturbance should arrive within days," Thane replied. "The full impact could last for months or even years." Marcus felt the familiar weight of command settling on his shoulders. His transport would leave in the morning, but these people would face the greatest challenge of their existence. The survival skills he had taught them were basic preparations, not solutions to a planetary catastrophe. "I need to speak with Federation Command," Marcus said. The communication delay to Earth made real-time conversation impossible. But Marcus recorded a detailed message explaining the situation and requesting permission to extend his assignment indefinitely. He sent similar messages to the Geological Survey team and the nearest Federation outpost, asking for any data that might help predict the disaster's scope. The first effects arrived even sooner than expected. The sky darkened as ash clouds blocked the sun, and temperatures began to drop rapidly. Plants started dying within days as photosynthesis became impossible. The careful ecosystem the Vorthak had learned to work with began collapsing around them. Marcus canceled his departure and began preparing the settlement for long-term survival. The techniques he taught now were far more advanced than anything he had previously shown them. Food preservation through smoking and drying, construction of insulated shelters that could retain heat, identification of alternative nutrition sources that could survive in the new environment. The Vorthak worked with desperate determination, applying everything they had learned over the past months. They stripped bark to make cordage, gathered every scrap of organic material that could be burned for fuel, and organized teams to hunt the few animals that had not yet fled or died. Kira emerged as a natural leader during the crisis, coordinating work teams and making decisions when Marcus was busy elsewhere. She had internalized his lessons so completely that she could anticipate problems and solutions almost as quickly as he could. Other young Vorthak looked to her for guidance when the human was not available. The crisis deepened as weeks passed. Temperatures continued dropping and the ash fall grew heavier. Reports came in from other settlements across the planet. Most were failing, their populations fleeing to already overcrowded refugee centers or simply disappearing into the chaos, but the Vorthak endured. They had learned to read their environment and adapt to changing conditions. When their stored food ran low, they knew which tree roots could be processed into emergency rations. When their heating fuel became scarce, they knew how to build fires that burned longer and cleaner. When predators driven from their natural territories began approaching the settlement, they knew how to defend themselves. Marcus watched with growing respect as his former students became teachers themselves, passing on the skills he had given them to newer arrivals who sought refuge at their settlement. The Vorthak had not simply learned to survive, they had learned to help others survive as well. The worst of the crisis lasted 4 months. When the ash finally began to clear and temperatures started to stabilize, the Vorthak settlement was one of only 3 major population centers left on the planet. They had not only survived but grown, taking in refugees from failed colonies and sharing their knowledge with anyone willing to learn. Marcus received approval for his extended assignment along with commendations for his work during the planetary emergency. But as he read the official recognition, he realized that the Federation still did not understand what had really happened on Kepler-442b. They saw a successful disaster response and gave credit to human leadership. Marcus saw something far more significant, a species that had transformed itself from helpless refugees into capable survivors, not because they had been forced to, but because they had chosen to. The Vorthak had become something new, and Marcus had been privileged to witness their transformation. Spring came late to Kepler 442b that year, delayed by the lingering effects of the volcanic winter. But when it finally arrived, the settlement burst into activity as the Vorthok worked to repair and expand their community. New buildings rose, using hybrid designs that combined their original architectural knowledge with the practical techniques Marcus had taught them. The population had grown from the original 300 colonists to nearly 800 as refugees. From failed settlements continued to arrive seeking shelter and guidance. The Vorthok welcomed them all, sharing food and knowledge without reservation. Their success had become a beacon of hope on a world that had seen too much disaster. Marcus watched from his quarters as work. Teams prepared new agricultural plots using methods that would work with the changed climate. The Vorthok had learned to see opportunity where others saw only problems. The volcanic ash that had nearly killed them was now being used as fertilizer. The lower temperatures that had threatened their crops were being used to preserve food for longer periods. Kira had been elected to lead the Agricultural Council, one of several governing bodies the Vorthok had established to manage their growing community. She was respected not just for her survival skills, but for her ability to bridge the gap between traditional Vorthok culture and their new reality. "The Federation transport arrives next week," she said, entering Marcus's quarters without knocking. They had moved far beyond formal protocols during the long crisis months. Marcus nodded. His original orders had finally been updated, calling him back to Earth for a new assignment. The bureaucrats in Federation Command had decided that Kepler 442b was stable again and no longer required special attention. "What will you tell them about us?" Kira asked. "That you do not need me anymore," Marcus said honestly. "That you have become what you needed to become." Kira smiled at that, but her expression remained thoughtful. "What we needed to become." "I like that phrase. It suggests we had a choice in the matter." "You always had a choice," Marcus said. "That was the point." Over. The following days, word spread through the settlement that Marcus would soon be leaving. The response surprised him. Individual Vorthok approached him to express their gratitude, but more than that, they wanted to share what they had learned and how they planned to use those lessons in the future. Young parents showed him how they were teaching their children to read weather patterns and identify edible plants. Craftsmen demonstrated tools they had designed that combined Vorthok engineering principles with human practicality. Engineers explained how they were modifying their technology to be more robust and maintainable using local resources. "You did not just teach us survival," an elderly Vorthok named Davik told him. "You taught us to think differently about our relationship with the world around us." The night before the transport was scheduled to arrive, the entire settlement gathered for what they called a celebration of growth. It was different from the formal farewell ceremony they had held before the volcanic crisis. This felt more personal, more meaningful. Thane stood before the crowd, but instead of giving a speech, he called for Marcus to join him in the center of the plaza. The human approached reluctantly, still uncomfortable with public attention. "You came here to teach us survival," Thane began, his aged voice carrying clearly in the evening air. "We thought we knew what that meant. We thought it was about learning to build fires and find food and shelter ourselves from the elements." The crowd murmured agreement, many nodding as they remembered their initial resistance to Marcus's primitive methods. "But we were wrong," Thane continued. "Survival is not about techniques or skills or knowledge. Survival is about the willingness to change, to adapt, to become something new when the old ways no longer serve." Marcus found himself looking out at faces that had become familiar over the past year. These were not the same Vorthok he had first met. They were harder, more confident, more capable, but they had not lost their essential kindness or their commitment to helping others. "We have a request," Thane said, turning to face Marcus directly. "We ask you to stay with us permanently, not as our teacher but as our friend and colleague. We offer you a place in our community, a voice in our decisions, a share in our future." The request hit Marcus like a physical blow. In 30 years of military service, he had never been asked to stay anywhere. He had always been the temporary solution, the troubleshooter who fixed problems and moved on to the next crisis. "Why?" he asked simply. Kira stepped forward to answer. Because you are part of what we have become. Your knowledge and our wisdom together have created something neither of us could have achieved alone. We want to continue that partnership. Marcus looked around the plaza at the settlement that had grown and changed so dramatically. Gardens flourished using techniques that combined Vorthic biotechnology with human agricultural wisdom. Buildings stood that could weather any storm using materials and methods that honored both engineering traditions. Children played games that taught survival skills while preserving Vorthic cultural values. The Federation expects me to report for reassignment, Marcus said. We have already contacted Federation Command, Thane replied. They have agreed to consider a permanent advisory position if you are willing to accept it. The crowd waited in silence for his answer. Marcus realized that this was the first time in his adult life that he had been given a real choice about his future. He had always gone where he was ordered, done what he was told, moved on when his mission was complete, but looking at these people who had become so much more than refugees or students, Marcus understood that some missions never really ended. They just transformed into something larger and more meaningful. I accept, he said quietly. The cheer that went up from the crowd could probably be heard in the next valley. Vorthak surrounded him, their long arms reaching out to touch his shoulders and hands in their traditional gesture of welcome. For the first time since arriving on Kepler 442b, Marcus felt like he was truly home. Later that night, as the celebration continued around cooking fires that had become as much social centers as practical tools, Marcus sat with Kira on a hillside, overlooking the settlement. The lights below twinkled like stars, each one representing lives that had been saved and futures that had been secured. Do you think we will be all right? Kira asked. In the long term, I mean. When new challenges come that we have not prepared for, Marcus considered the question carefully. You will face problems you cannot imagine right now. You will make mistakes and suffer losses and sometimes wonder if you can continue, Kira nodded, accepting the truth of his words. But you will adapt, Marcus continued. You will find solutions and help each other and become stronger than you were before. That is what survivors do. The transport arrived the next morning to find Marcus waiting with a message, declining passage to Earth. The pilot was confused but accepted the situation with military pragmatism. He had other passengers to collect and schedules to maintain. As the transport lifted off and disappeared into the morning sky, Marcus turned back toward the settlement where his new life waited. The Vorthak had taught him something he had never expected to learn, that sometimes the greatest victory was not in conquering or defeating, but in finding the place where you belonged and the people who wanted you to stay.